Hello, and welcome to the Alberta Library Trustees Association webinar on managing meetings. The purpose of this particular webinar is to introduce library trustees to some practices that should make their board meetings more useful and productive. So I'm going to start by asking our participants to introduce themselves, and then I'll launch them with the first question. So Jen, how about you?
Well, I'm Jen Ann Helliger. I have been a library trustee for almost 7 years now. I currently chair Town of Morinville's library board, and I am the vice chair of Northern Lights Library System board as well.
Okay, thanks, Jen. And Larissa.
Hi, I'm Larissa McLeod. I am a professional librarian, and as well, I am a parliamentarian, and I'm working on becoming a registered parliamentarian. If you're interested in knowing more about that, I can go into a bit more detail in our conversation. But also beyond that, I've done a lot of committee and board work, as well as, of course, internal committee work at pretty much all level, local, national, provincial, etc. So very excited to be speaking today.
Okay, so the first question is, why do we even have to have board meetings anyway?
Yeah, so I think that that's a really good place to actually start with questioning why are you having a meeting, because that's actually going to create a good foundation for having a functional meeting. I'm sure we've all had instances where we've been in meetings that could have been emails, but especially when you're looking at board meetings, it really is an opportunity for boards to come together to really plan the future direction that things are going to be moving, to have discussions about important aspects that might be impacting or could impact in the future. And also an opportunity for that board where each individual person has their own areas of expertise to have an opportunity to apply that to the information that could be impacting the organization they're, trying to plan for.
Okay, great, Larissa. So Jen, over to you for the questions.
Sure. So now we've figured out that we have to meet, and sometimes you sit in a meeting and you can sit there for 6 or 7 hours, and sometimes it's hard just to get everybody together. So to make sure that our meeting is done in an efficient manner, are there certain things that we need to make sure that we do before our meetings?
Absolutely. I tend to believe that the prep work for meetings is actually some of the most important work. And it really means that you're going to be able to use the meeting time really effectively, because everybody does have a lot going on in their life. We don't have time to waste in those meetings. So, first and foremost, even before you're setting up meetings with your board members, there definitely is the element of board orientation. So you want to make sure that new board members that are coming on are aware of what meetings are going to be like, how often you're going to have them, just in general, the expectations that they should have for meetings. Then when you're actually coming towards a meeting that you have, there is a lot of prep work that needs to go into it, but it's all going to be super useful prep work. One of the biggest things is going to be preparing that meeting package, and that's going to have the agenda, the minutes from the previous meeting to be approved, and then any reports. So that is work that's usually kind of a secretariat role, but it is really super key to preparing the board, because you want to make sure that that package with all of that information goes out, I would say, at least a week before the meeting, to really give an opportunity for board members to read, maybe highlight if there's any questions they want to ask in the meeting for clarification, anything like that, so that when they come into that meeting, they're really ready to actually have the important part, which is that discussion, the decision element. Yeah, so we will include some templates for some report templates and some other things that might be of use to folks. There isn't really a hard and fast rule about what those reports have to look like. The board can request particular information if they need it to be able to make those best decisions. But yeah, some templates can be of use as well.
Great. So then I would guess that one of the most important things, obviously, is that we need to make sure that our trustees are reading our agenda packages ahead of time. And I think it's good practice that you have more information in your agenda package, because the more informed your trustees are when they come to the meeting, the more beneficial the discussion around particular items can be. It's easy sometimes to get lost in the discussion, and the agenda really helps everybody keep on track to make sure that we're not sitting in meetings that are hours and hours long when we could have addressed those items during the reading of the actual package. So that's great. Just a quick follow-up. Who typically should be preparing the packages, the agenda packages?
Yeah, so that is usually a secretary role. However, of course, some of those reports are going to require information, perhaps from staff. In some instances, you may have board members who have a particular report. For example, the chair may need to write a report just updating folks on let's say the chair had a meeting with a particular other organization and they want to submit a report for information about what was discussed so that the rest of the board is in the know. That can be another one. So in some ways it can be a bit of a group effort, but for the most part, it's really secretary and staff that are probably putting it together.
Can I just add though that consultation with the chair at this point is always useful. And can I ask a question? And that has to do with, do you put the start and end times of your meeting on the agenda?
So I would recommend that best practices, well, of course, you do want to have the start time for sure. That's one more spot to remind people what time they should be showing up for that meeting, which is important, of course. But above and beyond that, I actually would recommend best practice would be to include a end time. There's been a lot of research that actually shows that shorter meetings are actually much more effective. And if you're providing folks with all of these reports written ahead of time, you should find that the actual meeting time that you require hopefully isn't, 6 hours long. So yes, I definitely do recommend putting an end time. That can also help people to recognize when discussion is happening, kind of how much time they're looking to spend in this meeting. And it may be something that, the board discovers we really can't make a decision today because we need this additional information. So we're going to have to request some more information and leave this decision for another meeting.
Great, I appreciate that. So we've gotten the agenda package out to everyone. Everybody's turned up for the meeting. So now functionally, we've started the meeting. What are some important things that we need to keep in mind while running the meeting, while following the agenda package?
I would say that there's probably a couple pieces that are the most important. Of course, it'll vary board to board. But I think one of the things is there's sometimes a bit of confusion over what needs a motion and what doesn't. So for example, you can format your agenda a number of different ways, but I tend to recommend that you have some categories. For example, having items that are for decision, that really indicates to the board members that this is something that you're looking to make a motion, make an action related to. Items for discussion, this might be something that really there requires more in-depth discussion of the board. There isn't a clear direction yet. These are the kind of items that might end up with a request for further information, referring it to a committee, etc. They can also lead to a motion in that in that meeting, but they require a bit more in-depth discussion than, say, an item for decision usually does. And then there's items for information. So these are really just to keep the board in the know. So when you're thinking of what things require motions, for example, accepting a report that is just for information doesn't actually technically need a motion to accept that. Depending on your particular rules, you may have it where there is kind of the chair will mention, if there isn't any concerns, we can note in the minutes that this report was accepted for information. That can be very nice because then the minutes will clearly state that that report was received for information. But it's almost more like a little check mark saying, yes, this was received. Then, of course, you have items for decision. Those are really the things that are, yes, we want to do this or that. So I like to think of it as though you're kind of driving down a road and the items for decision are really whether you're going to turn left at the lights, turn right, or keep going straight. They're things that require the board to take action or to do something. And so you're stating what you're going to do. Whereas reports for information or items for information, I like to think of those more like billboards that you see while you're driving. They could contain some information that might be really useful to you down the road, but at this time, they're mostly just for you to know. There isn't any action required. You don't see a billboard and suddenly have to make a turn. So those are kind of how I think of them to kind of keep it straight in my own head.
Perfect. So then when the agenda package goes out, so then obviously a good practice is to make sure that you identify when something needs to have a motion or needs to be for decision. And then generally a good practice is for those items that need to have a decision, you include the pertinent information and any briefing notes around that, because the more information you can provide ahead of time, again, the better tasked our trustees are with making that decision. So once you get to that item on the agenda and you know that it needs a decision, who can make the motion? And if I make a motion, can I vote in favor of it? Can the chair vote on a motion? Can you maybe cover a couple of those things?
Sure, yeah. So again, this can be something that can depend a little bit on the particular rules of your board. But if, for example, we look at Robert's Rules of Order and kind of use that as an example to go off of to speak on this, most people sometimes think that if you are someone who first and seconds a motion relating to something, that you're saying you want to have it happen, that you approve it. In actuality, with Robert's Rules, it usually goes first, second, and then that item is open for discussion. So the first and second are actually just individuals of the board who have the right to make motions. So it's usually going to be most board members, I would imagine. They're going to be able to first, second, and then there can be that part of discussion where there can be clarifying questions asked. Folks can discuss and deliberate. And then once there's no longer any other, say, amendments or discussion on the item, that's when you can then have the chair call the question, which is call the vote on that motion. So one thing that you mentioned in there was about the chair voting. And that is, again, another area where there sometimes can be some confusion. It can be dependent on your rules, but in general, because the chair is usually a member of the board as well who does have voting rights, the chair is able to vote. However, because their role as chair requires them to kind of be the impartial guiding voice of the meeting, they don't vote unless there's a secret ballot or in instances where their vote would matter. So if there is a tie or their vote would create a tie. So this means in the case where you have unanimous or almost unanimous votes going one way or another, you're not going to know how the chair voted. But that's part of them being the chair, creating that air of impartiality, because they're the ones kind of guiding this meeting along.
Okay, great. So now we know who can make a motion and what happens when everybody votes. So just something to consider too, and the importance of once a vote has been made, you'll often see times where the vote can be quite split. And so what happens when there is a decision and it's not the decision that you voted for? If you're not happy with that decision, what happens after that meeting or after that vote? And so, yeah, sorry.
That can be a great question, because of course, with any good work that people are doing, there can sometimes be elements that people have opposing opinions on, and that's just part of board work. The thing to remember, and this is something that you can be clear about when you're orienting your new board members coming on, is, well, of course, you want to make sure that there is that good discussion and decision-making happening in the meeting. Once the board makes a vote, whatever direction the board heads, you're all as the board making that, you're headed in that direction. So, if even if it wasn't the direction you would have preferred, once that vote has happened, you want to make sure that you have your board member cap on solidly, and it's a collaborative effort to, we're now going to move the board in this direction. We have all agreed to do this, even if the vote was split. In the end, let's say it was a vote that required majority and it got majority, then that's the direction you're headed, and you want to be in support of that.
Perfect. So it's definitely important that the board all speaks with one voice, regardless of how you felt on that specific matter. And I think it's important too to remember that just because you might have split votes doesn't mean your board is dysfunctional or anything like that. Your board is having open discussion, and you've selected those trustees to give, those trustees have been appointed to give their different viewpoints and hopefully steer the direction of the library in a successful matter. So now we've gone through these items, we've looked at a bunch of reports, we've made some decisions on important items, and we likely have somebody taking the minutes. Does the person taking the minutes have to be a board member?
So no, in fact, it probably would be easiest if it wasn't a board member. Some folks will have a specific, like a secretary who does that. That way the person recording the minutes isn't worried about making sure that they're voting or anything like that. They can be solely focused on recording the information. And if I can also add in this, just because we're talking about minutes, in terms of the amount of information that minutes include, usually you're talking about wanting to include the motions and keeping track of action items, unless specifically required in your rules of order. You're not going to want a transcription. In fact, having a full transcription can sometimes really impact the ability of board members to have that fulsome discussion prior to voting on a decision. So that can be really important to keep in mind as well.
Great. So then most of our information is always going to be kept in the agenda package. And then basically your minutes just break out what the outcomes were of the motions and that sort of a thing. Perfect. So then you've had your meeting and hopefully you've run a really successful and efficient meeting. So we've left on time. So then what happens, or what are there things that need to get done after the meeting? And then perhaps in preparation even for the next meeting?
See, and that's exactly the mindset you want to have, is coming out of one meeting with your brain already thinking about how can I make the next meeting even more successful? What can I do to help that next meeting? So that, for starters, is the perfect mindset to have. One of the key things that you would want to make sure to get is you would like to get the draft of those minutes done up as soon as possible. Most folks will have the minutes drafted up and then share them immediately with the board who attended, just to be able to get feedback if there is any mistakes in it or anything that can be corrected right then, if there's anything that was missed, etc. Well, it's still fresh in people's minds. You want to make sure you get that as soon as possible. The other key thing is keeping track somewhere in some way of the action items and who's going to be doing what. So a lot of times this can be as simple as really like a little Excel sheet that just keeps track of, board member A is going to be reaching out to connect with organization B to let them know that we want to move ahead with project C. And then that way, when you come around to the next meeting, you can make sure that you can check in and say, okay, board member A, has that been completed? Is it ongoing, etc. So that's an important piece to make sure that then whatever was passed in the meeting, any of those actions actually do happen.
I really appreciate that idea of doing the draft minutes and getting those out immediately. I think in practice, they often kind of just get skimmed over because once it's been a month or potentially 2 or 3 months in between meetings, your recollection of exactly what's in those minutes is probably not as great anymore. So it's not uncommon for something like that to get a rubber stamp and people not look at it really quickly. So taking that opportunity to have a review of them immediately or shortly after the meeting, at least, just make sure that they're accurate, because those meetings can be seen by other people who are not members of the board. And it's important that they're reflective of the decisions that the board made, for sure.
Oh, definitely. And also keeping in mind that those are going to be very important records for any board members who come after you in terms of understanding the decisions previous boards made and the directions that they went. So, they definitely do deserve more than just a rubber stamp. So I really encourage people to, review them. If the draft gets sent out ASAP, to review it then while it's still fresh in your mind. And then again, when that agenda package comes out and it includes those minutes for approval, to review it again then to, make sure everything's there, but also to get you in the right mindset to be looking at this next meeting and continuing those directions that you had set previous.
Perfect. I appreciate all your input. I think it's pretty common that when library board trustees get freshly appointed to their board, they often turn up in a meeting and don't realize how much work goes on, how much work the board does, how many important decisions get made. So you turn up to a meeting and you don't know what to expect. So I really appreciate the idea of templates and making sure that when you onboard your trustees, that you have those conversations with them ahead of time, because then they can come in feeling confident and ready to contribute and have those discussions. So I think the onboarding is just as important as making sure that you have a good agenda package and you have someone who's running the meeting efficiently. I really appreciate all of your input today. Margaret, is there anything that perhaps you wanted to we could also cover, or Larissa, perhaps something that we need to circle back to?
I was actually just going to wrap it up with the idea that having a policy for your board can really help, because it simplifies how you're going to do things. And so in the resource package that comes with this webinar, we're going to include a sample of one of those policies, actually from Morinville Library. We're also going to include a sample of meeting templates that are used by libraries. So that'll be a sample agenda, how to bring forward a motion, how to bring forward a report for information, and how to bring forward something for discussion. So people will want to adapt those, but that they might find that a useful starting place. And Larissa's going to add some more stuff about parliamentarian options for information if you want to go more formal. So I think that that wraps it up. I'd like to thank you both actually for what was really interesting and should be helpful, I think, to many library boards as they just try to make their meetings a little more productive to save some time. So thanks.
Wonderful. Thanks, everyone.